Okay, sorry if there was a delay there. I was trying to get my upload back here. So in the previous recording, we left off with poem 34. So I want to move on to poem 62. And this is probably one of the better known sonnets from Petrarch. And again, it's dealing with that eternal conflict between his love for Laura and his love for God. So the question I raised here is, in this sonnet, we see that Petrarch, 11 years after he met her, is still carrying his torch for Laura, but who is he addressing the poem to, and what is he asking for? Well, I don't think it takes rocket science really to figure out the response to that, right? Father in heaven after each lost day. So it's a prayer, right? After each lost day, each night spent raving with that fierce desire which in my heart has kindled into fire, seeing your acts adorned for my dismay. So it's a prayer. He's obviously addressing God, but what is the subject of that prayer? Again, it is his infatuation with Laura. He's actually pleading for God to give him the strength to get her out of his head. If there is a just and merciful God, this God hopefully will give him that strength to be able to get over this addiction to her. Right, so one of the things that we'll establish about the Petrarchan sonnet, the way that they're constructed, is that those first 8 lines, the octet, sets up a problem. And then that problem is either solved or there's some sort of resolution in the concluding part of the poem, which is the sistet, those concluding 6 lines. So in that section of the poem, he says, the 11th year, my Lord, has now come round, since I was yoked beneath the heavy trace that on the meekest weighs most cruelly. Pity the abject plight where I am found, return my straying thoughts to a nobler place. He's pleading for that, right? Show them this day you were on Calvary. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward, right? It's a poem that is a prayer for willpower, right? To the will to overcome this obsession. One of the things, again, that we see so frequently with Petrarch as he moves through this body of work is the role of Laura takes on different aspects depending on what mood he's in, what place he's in, what, where is he at spiritually at the time that he writes the poem. Because sometimes he's in a good place where he feels like he's got a handle on his feelings for Laura, and sometimes he's in a very dark place when he writes these poems. Sometimes he's feeling a lot of guilt, he's beating himself up really bad. The next day he might write something totally different, right? And Laura might again be the greatest thing that ever happened to him in his life. But right now, this poem seems to come from one of his darker places. And the reason I say that, it's hopeful in its spiritual aspect. It's hopeful for the idea of redemption, but it's a dark poem in that it's one of those where he seems to be resigned to the fact that he has wasted a lot of his life with this kind of foolish obsession. But again, like I say, we see him go through so many stages and kind of waffling back and forth with how he views this relationship with Laura. And so in poem 126, we know that there are several poems that he wrote after her death. What is he remembering? What does he hope happens for Laura when her spirit returns to this place? And in the last few lines, what other memory does he keep going back to, and how is that entwined with the present memory? Well, to answer that, let's just kind of look at those last few stanzas. Now, in much of the poem, it seems like he's returned to a place where he has a happy memory of her. And again, as we've said before, there's a lot of speculation, a lot of mystery about the true nature of this relationship. Were they ever actually a real thing? Were they actually real lovers at some point? We just don't really know. But here, he's either going back to an actual place that they visited, or he's going back to a place that he's concocted in his imagination as this happy place where they perhaps consummated their love. Whatever the case may be, he's got a very happy memory associated with this place. And then he says, "How many times did I say to myself then, full of awe, she was surely born in paradise. Her divine bearing and her face and her words and her sweet smile had so laden me with forgetfulness and so divided me from the true image that I was sighing." So again, we see that conflict of guilt, right? Laura's been a good thing, she's been a bad thing. "How did I come here and when, thinking I was in heaven, not there where I was? From then on this grass has pleased me so that elsewhere I have no peace. If you had as many beauties as you have desire, you could boldly leave the wood and go among people." So again, this poem seems to be coming from one of those darker places where he is sort of questioning whether this has been the will of God or has this been the will of a darker force that has tempted him off the straight and narrow path. But, when we get to 189, that particular poem, again, we see him putting Laura up on that pedestal. I said in this sonnet, he describes being tossed at sea and lost in a winter of darkness as a metaphor. What is it a metaphor for? Well, now a little bit of backstory here. We do know that this was a poem he wrote shortly after learning of her death. And that's important to keep in mind. So he says, "My ship laden with forgetfulness passes through a harsh sea. At midnight in the winter between Scylla and Charybdis, and at the tiller sets my lord rather than my enemy. Each oar is manned by a ready, cruel thought that seems to scorn the tempest and the end. A wet, changeless wind of sighs, hopes, and desires breaks the sail. A rain of weeping, a mist of disdain wet and loosen the already weary ropes, made of error twisted up with ignorance, it's a simple metaphor, actually. You know, he's comparing his life to a great storm. He's like that ship that's been tossed at sea. And then in that last stanza, he says, "My two usual sweet stars are hidden." Stars were what the ancient sailors used, right, to guide and navigate them at sea. But here, the stars are not stars in the sky. They are the eyes of Laura that has guided him. But he says they're hidden now because she's died. They've buried her. Dead among the waves are reason and skill, so that I begin to despair of the port. Again, that beautiful metaphor, right, of being that ship lost at sea. He's being tossed around. The waves are overpowering him. And when sailors really were lost at sea, what did they want more than anything? They wanted to get safe passage. They wanted to find the port. They needed those guiding lights, right? Without Laura, he says his soul despairs of all of this. There is no port. There is no safe place. There is no guidance in the storm, because he no longer has her in his life. He never did have her in his life, really, but now she's dead, so literally she is gone from the earth, and there is no chance of her ever being part of his life. All right, next video I'm going to talk briefly about that last poem of his that you have in your text, and then we should be a wrap at that point. That should get us through all of the poems of Petrarch that are in the anthology. So I will pick this up next video.